Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 30, Taming Textured Substrates. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. It is time for the Takeup again. It is 2:30 in the Mountain Time Zone, running a little tiny bit late because we had some audio issues, but we are back on track and ready to talk texture. I know that we are coming up into a season where everything is textured. There is a ton of thick, unruly, difficult materials that we're going to have to deal with, and it's something that I've talked about quite a lot. Now, might not be the longest topic to cover because there are some really simple answers to this stuff, but unfortunately, it's something that I continually have to cover because people have issues dealing with it. Like I said, every time we talk about texture, there's multiple things we can get into. We're talking about high pile materials. We're talking about fuzzy materials. We're talking about fluffy materials. We're talking about heavy knits. We're talking about anything that has a texture that causes us to have difficulty with our top stitching sinking in, becoming overwhelmed, or falling apart. So today we will get into a little bit of that. We're going to talk about toweling. We're going to talk about faux fur, sherpa, and all of that stuff. But the truth of the matter is, a lot of this is fairly simple. So I'll discover from you guys, maybe some of your problems you've had. We can discuss what's going on there. And I may also talk about some other subjects that we had going on this week as far as what's in the embroidery community. I've been asked a lot of questions, but many of them varied and all over the board. This was certainly part of what people were talking about as they're getting ready, like I said, for fall, for colder climates, because as we get into that, that's where we get a lot of this textured material and gift materials. But honestly, it's something that I've talked about repeatedly for multiple reasons. It came up this week. I will say that we had a lot of other topics come up that I might want to get into as well. So let's see what we're going to get to today. Hopefully we can give you something useful. And if nothing else, I know that the techniques I talked about today have been very useful for me and have been one of the top very simple things I've been able to help people action on to fix designs. Some of the stuff that I talk about is actually from a speech that I gave, another presentation I gave that was called Editing for Non-Digitizers, because some of what we're going to do today is something you can do easily to an existing stitch file without any trouble. So before we get any further into it, I'd like to go ahead and call out some of the people who are in the comments, listening live, and some of the awesome comments I got. And first thing, I'll just go ahead and call out this one, Bonnie Roylance. We'll be watching the posted video. Thanks for taking time to create these. I am almost all cut up, and the information I gained has been a big help. And what I'm going to say is what I said to Bonnie, to you folks. It absolutely makes my day to hear that these videos have been helpful to you. And whether it's here, whether it's any of the embroidery groups I frequent, whether it's on my blog or derrycloth.com, whether it is in our Embrilliance community where I get to go in and help with the people digitizing there, there's absolutely nothing better than being able to help you guys. And I love that you're listening in. So all of you, you are why I do this. If you're here, I'm here for you. And you give me the fuel to keep on going. So thank you very much for being here. Cindy's there. And she'll be catching the replay too. She's got a customer at the moment. Make that money. Keep those needles moving. Do not worry about watching the Takeup. You can watch it anytime. That's why Facebook and YouTube are here. Catch it on the archive and comment later, and we'll get back to you. Donna Scott Johnson. Hey, y'all. Happy to be here. Happy to have you here, Donna. Terry, happy to see you here. Happy Friday. I agree. Not that Saturday or Sunday are going to be any less busy. Have a ton of stuff backed up to do. It's been an incredibly busy week, but we'll be getting onto it. As we always say, especially if you're somebody out there with an entrepreneurial bent, you have the freedom to work any 24 hours of any day that you have. And we'll be doing a lot of that too. Gustav from Sweden. Hello, man. I've got to learn to say your name correctly. But thank you for joining in. Mary from actually up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, Marianne Shirley Romero Soto. Hola to you too. Justin Armenta, digitizer himself, and has been presenting over at MNerd. Good day, sir. Good day to you. And here, Ramona McKee says, afternoon, taming textured substrates. My mind's eye saw you in a lion's cage with a whip and a chair. Yeah, that's taming customers. That's a very different thing. But yeah, taming the textured substrate. You'll find that I like to use alliteration, where I use that same letter to start names of things pretty often. If you check the title of stuff, I can't help it very much. This is left over from all of my time as a medievalist. If you guys know that I studied kind of pre-Christian Germanic Scandinavia, stuff like that. I studied a lot of that when I was younger in college. And alliteration is part of the poetry in Old Norse and in Old English. And so I get a lot of that stuff. So taming textured substrates, you're lucky there wasn't 3 T's in there, kids. Silvia from Romania, happy to be there live. Thank you for joining in. That's awesome. Jeff Fuller, Jeff, happy to see you as well. Brian, who I got to talk to today, Brian Bailey, creator of Embrilliance, and somebody who's I'm going to talk about again today because we have some history discussing this very topic. A big hello from New Mexico, and yes, hello from me in Albuquerque, New Mexico, to all of you as well. Marianne saying, always a great idea to have water soluble on hand always. You know, yes, water soluble is good, but I'm going to make a comment about that not everybody's going to love on water soluble. Or at least not everybody's going to love unless they have done the right things for what they need to do here. Frank Dunn from UK, good evening to you, sir. Thank you for joining in late in your day. And Lisa Morgan from Kentucky, happy to have you here as well. So thank you very much for coming in, everybody. Thank you for joining. I'm glad to have you in. And like I always say, if you can't catch this all, catch it on the replay. Please share this with your friends if you like it. I would love to have more people in the community. And all of you people who watch the Takeup are the best of the best. If you're here listening and learning and trying to increase your abilities and understand how to do embroidery better, then you are already in the top 1%. So cheers from me to you. You guys are the best by default, just because you're in here learning. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about taming textured substrates. Now, certainly this is something I've discussed many times. I have a couple of blog posts that are rather older blog posts, a couple of articles that are older articles as well, because to tell you the truth, this is something that I don't think has changed a ton. I don't feel like there has been a lot of change in what we do with these garments, what we do with this kind of apparel, with this kind of accessory, as far as taming texture substrates. The funny thing is, of course, more new people come in every day. People come in with different backgrounds and they have to learn this stuff. So it's not like we're not going to continue teaching and learning and working in different ways. So we teach this stuff over and over again. And like I said, if you guys have an awesome way you like to do this, I want to hear it in the comments. Let's discuss it. Let's hash it out. But there are some older articles that I've gotten. I'd like to share them with you if I can. So let's go ahead and see if we can grab ourselves this window. So this is the article that everybody kind of knows from me, and I actually have the samples on hand, which is always fun. I like when I get to have the actual live samples here for you to see that are the real pieces. So it's like you can tell I didn't just take pictures and Photoshop them, folks. They look real nice on a towel. But we actually have the real pieces here. So I should say this is one of the articles that everybody kind of relates to me in textured substrates. So this is the taming texture article. I'll go ahead and post this up for you guys to take a look at. There's a couple of them that we're going to talk about here because we also have the part 2 where you talk about knit hats. We might not get deeply into it, but the thing is, I don't think we need to get deeply into it because we're going to get into the basics of what we do with texture and why texture causes issues. And when we do that, we're going to be able to essentially give you the building blocks for any textured substrate, anything that's going to have that sort of depth, that sort of interference, the looping, the fur, anything else. So go ahead and check that article out. It's in the comments now, wherever you are, Facebook or YouTube, you'll be able to get a hold of that. But the thing that's interesting here essentially is to say that we're going to talk about how embroidery on these things, on towels, on fleece, on fur, what can we do to make that better? And you'll have to pardon me, had a little error with my display here for a second. Let's go ahead and take a look at this. Essentially, we know that when we're working on things that are high pile, when they have loops, when they have fibers, when they have fur, whenever they have something that is sitting up proud of our surface, that we're going to have some interference when it comes to our embroidery, especially when we're doing something that is light, something that has a lot of open areas in it, or if it just doesn't have a deep stroke. If we have thick, large satin stitch areas, big filled blocks, the likelihood is these things are going to smash down our pile. That pile we're talking about is those loops, that fur, that cut work. We're talking about like velvet has a pile as well. But really, the top thing I've dealt with is generally it's going to have to be either the heavy toweling, big, thick toweling, or sherpa and other kinds of fleece. These are the things that I usually deal with people when they're having issues. And essentially, whatever you do, you're going to have to battle these loops. These loops, that pile is going to want to come through your embroidery. It's going to want to come through your embroidery, and it's going to want to overshadow your embroidery, right? So what do I mean by this? It's either going to want to come through, which is that somehow during the process of the embroidery going down, you have loops that want to pop up and come through the stitching, either between stitches or through the stitches, or you have a light area or an area that's not covered, and these loops are going to be free and they're going to come loose. Or overshadowing, even if you have a nice, dense, covered area in your embroidery, when there is a really heavy pile, a really thick pile, the edges of the embroidery are going to get overshadowed as those loops kind of fall back in shadow edge over the outside edge of your area. So no matter what you have to do, you're going to be trying to control these loops. And there's a few things that always come up when we talk about this, and I actually kind of talked about it briefly when we first came in because we had a comment about having water soluble on hand. And by the way, I fully agree, water soluble is integral, but here's the thing, and I'm actually going to pull out to say this. A lot of people work with work with support materials to make this work out, right? What I've seen quite a lot is that people are using water soluble to take a standard design that hasn't been altered whatsoever, something that just has, let's say, a non-underlaid satin stitch monogram, and maybe it's bold enough that it's not really showing on the edges, you're not getting overshadowing, it's not really showing you that kind of where it sinks into the pile and you don't have that edge clarity, or that the lines are so thin that it sucks right down into the pile. Even if you have a thick design, okay, we've done that, and we use water soluble, right? We use a water soluble stabilizer. So what do we have? We have a thin water soluble film that we're dumping on top of our design area, on top of our fabric, our garment, our accessory, and then we're stitching over that. And yes, that water soluble will hold down the pile. It'll hold down the loops. It'll hold down the fibers for the period of time that you're sewing. And honestly, incredibly useful to do that no matter what technique we're talking about here. You generally can say that that's going to help if you're having issues holding down that pile. Like I said, later on we're going to talk about different methods. But here's the thing. When you use these materials, it's easy to say, temporary materials are temporary. Just because you hold down the pile of that material while you're sewing doesn't mean it's going to remain that way when this is a product. And especially people are showing me this on toweling. Well, you know, toweling gets wet and has to be washed frequently. It has to be laundered frequently, and people don't always have as many towels as they have garments. They're going to be using them repeatedly and laundering them. And when you use temporary materials, yes, it can look good at first, but I will attest to the fact that if you put a nice tight satin stitch down on top of that toweling that's heavy, that has all those loops, that the loops can rise through the design after the fact. They can ferret their way through the stitching after the fact and look poor. So temporary materials are good for support, but they're not necessarily a permanent solution to loops or pile coming through material. So do we use water-soluble toppings? You can. You can, depending on how you're doing things. I don't always. You can, and they do help. And honestly, what I used to use them a lot for is actually less textured materials, things like basket weave polo shirts, things where I'm having sink down, have small lettering, small details that are sinking down into a knit garment, and that sometimes helps to float the stitching above it. But that's something where when I release that stuff, when I wash it out, when I steam it out, when the garment is worn, I'm not going to see that texture popping up or the stitches trying to sink down further. Whereas you do see that when you're holding down super heavy piles. So temporary materials are temporary. So that kind of causes some issues, and it's not the best. Now, I'm actually going to go ahead and pop this open anyway. Here's something that Brian Bailey said, and this is true also, heat away. You can, instead of using a water soluble stabilizer, you can use a heat away temporary topping. And that also has place where you can't use water. Absolutely, totally true. What I'll say is that though I do like these materials, and I think heat away works for when you can't use water, and there's certain things I know there are high-end, high-pile materials that cannot be wet without having issues, and I know that people working with high-end upholstery, home decor, stuff like that will definitely have more to say about materials that you can't use water on. But you could use a heat away topping if they can withstand heat. The thing is that even that, I would say, yes, it's there, it's still temporary. So if we're having issues with a super high pile material, that's probably not going to be your main solution, or probably shouldn't be your only solution. So whenever we talk about dealing with these materials, when we're talking about dealing with taming those textures, we're really going to be looking for something that is in the stitch, in the embroidery, part of the digitizing, part of the embroidery to solve the problem, right? Because here's the other thing too. Somebody will tell me, in fact, I'll bring this back up again. Temporary materials are temporary. The problem is people say, okay, well, I don't use a temporary material. I use a plastic. I stitch over a plastic material and tear it away from the outside edge. And I'm here to tell you that that's also temporary, because most of the time when somebody does this, or at least when I have had it presented to me as a solution, once again, I don't think that it's not that it's a wash away material. The problem is that it doesn't often hold up to laundering, especially the kind of laundering you will do for toweling or for something that is laundered heavily the way that thread does. Frequently, and this has actually happened to me directly, I've had a product, something bought for me, and I'll say this much, I'll kind of call this out, had embroidered towels that were purchased for me, and it was something that I used to use, and I'm not going to call the brand out or whatever it was, but somebody had these towels embroidered for me, and these towels, after being laundered for a while, the plastic that was inside under the satin stitches, it had large satin stitch motifs on this piece, the plastic inside started to degrade, and you could see the plastic coming out. It was feather edging coming out of the satin stitches. And then when it finally broke down enough, not only plastic was coming out of it, but you could see the pile beneath, and it started to split the wide satin stitches of the overlying design. So plastic, while it can be more permanent than a temporary water-soluble, heat away, other sort of stabilizer that you're going to use, or not stabilizer, but topping. We're talking about something we're not really using for dimensional stability. If you want to call the stability of the surface a thing, I guess you could. But people often say water-soluble stabilizer when I'm really referring to a topping, a film. The thing is, even though that plastic is more permanent, that plastic isn't probably going to hold up for the life of the apparel or the life of a towel particularly, and it's not going to hold up the way thread does. So what I always encourage people to do is look at structural methods of building up a foundation with thread. Because one thing that I know is going to last as long as the embroidery on top is probably embroidery underneath. Thread is thread. Polyester thread that is ready to be laundered is going to last the same way, whether it's the underlay stitching or it's the top stitching. So what we really want to do is to use that material, that thread, to build up. And actually, like I said, I'm going to bring in another comment here, and this is true though. No hate for water-soluble films, and this is absolutely true. Sylvia says, I use water-soluble on polo shirts when I stitch small letters. Me too. A lot of piqué polos, if you look at them, sometimes that piqué pattern, those divots that are in piqué polo, they are 1 millimeter wide. And so they're going to drop small letter columns right into them and cause roughness and textural issues on your little tiny satin stitches. So yeah, water soluble, great for polo shirts. So yeah, I use it a lot. And it doesn't mean you can't use it for toweling as well. Sometimes it can help you to hold stitches up while you're working on them, but I still think you want a structural underlay. So one of the things we're going to discuss here today for sure is underlay, and we're going to discuss underlay as a foundation. All right, underlay as a foundation. So here's what I mean by that. Let's go ahead and pop back up our image of my work that I wanted to show you here. Now, this is our Taming texture article. We're talking about high pile materials, and here's the first thing I'm going to show you. Here is an incredibly high pile, very light. This is a very thin gauge high pile kind of chenille. It's an armband, and it's really thick, but also has very fine loops. So it comes through everything. And in here, I'm using a global underlay. We're going to talk about that again later. So this is using no other stabilizing materials. There's no film that being used here. It's all stitches that's holding that down. Same thing here. That is all stitches. No film was used in the process of creating this. This was using, it's a process that I call a light mesh fill. And we're going to talk more about the terminology behind this. And honestly, a little fun story that ended up in me working here at Embroidery, to tell you the truth. and also in my friendship and discussions with Brian Bailey, creator of Embroidery, we talked a lot about this topic back in the day. But this particular piece here, once again, none of this is done with any sort of films or toppings. And this piece either. Now, this is a piece that doesn't have a global underlay. This just has structural underlay. And this piece doesn't have any stabilizing materials, any sort of toppings used in creating it either. These are all using structural underlay. So what we're really going to look for here today, we're talking about underlay as a foundation for our top stitching. And this is the image that I usually like to show. So I'm going to go ahead and put myself back on screen here because I like to talk with my hands. So let's just say I'll probably run you through this illustration a little bit. I like to use underlay as a foundation because we have the ability to build in 3 dimensions. If you have been on any of the other Takeup shows, you know that I try and talk about dimensional embroidery for artistic reasons. I talk about building in layers for dimensional reasons so that we can have things laying on top of each other in a way that is sensible, that we like to see for dimension, to build up that light relief, almost like a sculpture. The thing is, we can also use this structurally. When we think about a high pile material, something that has loops, something that has fibers sticking out, a sherpa, a fleece, polar fleece. So no matter what kind of piled material there is, you're talking about these little fibers. And if you look at the top here, top left of this image, it's like a little boardwalk. It's a boardwalk over a grassy field. And if you just lay the boards out in the grassy field, the grass will stick up through the loose gaps between the boards. And here we are, we have grass sticking through. We don't want that. We don't want to see the grass, right? So what we're trying to do with our structural underlay, we're trying to make sure that grass is dealt with. First thing we have, edge run. If we have an edge run or a contour underlay, depending on where you're at, we've built these 2 little rails, and you see now my stitching is up on these 2 rails. It's partially up. It's held up a little bit above the grass here, and that's not exactly a great way to say it because we do have tension that's dragging things down. But what you can see is I now have rails that on top of which I'm going to run my satin stitch. So that's a satin stitch on top of an edge walk underlay. It's very much like rails underneath the boardwalk. And then if I had a zigzag underlay on top of that, zigzag or a double zig, or German underlay. If you're somebody who comes from that lace world where they had a lot of those underlays, that's really how that got that term. You would have these zigzags on top of it. And you see how those provide additional coverage and a layer that lifts the top boards up. Now, this is not exactly a structural way to show this, but it just gives you an idea. We're getting these structural rails that hold the edges of our satin stitch up. They lift it up off of the ground. They also hold the quality of the edge because they have something to grab onto. That rail has something to grab on. The stitches provide something to grab onto those stitches to grab onto, rather. So we have that structure. Then we throw the zigzag under there, and you can see that any one of these stitches that's across here is going to encounter two rails and at least at one point this zigzag. And if we had a double zigzag, we now have four essentially perpendicular pieces of thread that each one of those satin stitches has to go over. They're being held up at several points. They have places where there's more color coverage because of the thread being under there. It's at a different angle from the top. And it's also lifting that material out of the grass, if you want to call it that. But actually, in this case, what it really is more appropriately doing is it's flattening it down. It's flattening it down. Now, I believe I've got some other images I can show you on here, and hopefully I've got everything set up correctly. Like I said, had a couple little technical difficulties here, but let's go ahead and see if I can show you. Now, we'll just go back to this image. I think that one should show it well enough. But you can see over here in the upper right-hand corner, and I'll go ahead and go full screen with that and let you have a shot at it. But in the full screen layout here, this essentially, this image, we'll open this in a new tab so you can take a look at it. That image here shows you on the upper right-hand corner that just with the underlay, you can see in this incredibly thick toweling, this toweling is very heavy, very thick, and it definitely has the danger of overshadowing the edges of this monogram. But on this big, thick monogram run on this very heavy toweling, with just that underlay, just that edge run, just the zigzags over top of it, it's holding down those loops to that degree. We can already see it sinking, and you can see that in the center of this piece, that the loops have been folded down toward the center of the column and are being held down. So using the appropriate underlay and the correct amount of underlay, the correct structure in the underlay, lets us build up both a foundation. We build up a foundation, our rails and our planks, to hold up that top stitching. And we also hold down the pile underneath it. We tie it down, we lock it down into the surface. When we can lock it down into the surface like that, we have a much better chance of getting clarity. So that's the first part of this thing that we're looking at. We're using underlay structurally, even on a satin stitch. We're using those explicit stitches to build up a platform. So think about this, like you are walking on a plane. And in fact, I always encourage you to do this. When you're looking at fabrics and you're worrying about texture, this doesn't help with stretch, unfortunately. Stretch is an entirely different thing, but when you're talking about texture, think of your embroidery as if we are walking on the garment. We are tiny little ants, we are walking on the garment, and you will start to see knits have incredible ribs, these valleys and peaks that we're going up and down. We can understand that at the scale of thread, textures that don't seem to make that much difference to us when we're wearing a garment will absolutely make a problem for a 1 millimeter stitch. When we're talking about tiny text, when we're talking about tiny details, these stitches will sink in. And we remember, they're under tension. Here's our thread. We have these two loops with our fabric. They're under tension. They're pulling together. They want to pull together. That's why we have pull. They're under tension. It's trying to collapse that fabric. It's trying to sink in because everything's under tension. We're trying to balance that out, but at the same time, we know those loops want to pull down to the material. So we know that we're going to have some of that sinking going on. We have to mitigate that sinking, and we want to prepare the surface of the embroidery as best we can. Now, this is what we would do under a satin stitch. That's all that is. That little plank explanation I gave you, and by the way, I'm glad to see that some of you people have seen this and like that explanation. That plank explanation helps you with your satin stitch. But here's the other thing I'm going to show you is that there's something even more basic that we can do that will help with any design outside of it. This is something we have to do in our digitizing straight away. This is something where you're going to either use automated underlay tools, or if you are a bloody-minded perfectionist like myself, you will sit there with your straight stitch tool and you will draw in your own underlays. And I have done that even when we're talking about somebody else's design that I couldn't alter, I didn't have objects for. You can do that with your satin stitch. The cool thing is, and it also works with satin stitches on top of it, there is a way for us to use global underlay to handle this. And we're certainly going to have this discussion. Let me go ahead and talk about this piece that I'm showing on screen here, and it lets me talk about some stories about my history, both with Brilliance and with embroidery, and my friend Brian Bailey, who is out in the comments there. We actually discussed this before, because most people know a couple terms, right? People understand that there are terms for what I'm talking about. A global underlay that we use to flatten the pile of a material so that we get a good texture. And what most people are going to call it is knockdown stitch. And here's the thing, I called it a knockdown stitch, and I said personally for myself, I talked about knockdown stitching in a blog, and I ended up getting a message from Mr. Brian Bailey saying, hey, knockdown, actually, what you're talking about, number one, knockdown is, here's something that knockdown is and what it isn't. And also, knockdown is actually a trademark. So if you guys don't know this is actually a fun little piece of history for Embrilliance people, especially. Knockdown stitching, knockdown is a trademark term from Embrilliance. That is actually their term. Knockdown is not a general term. I know people want to treat it like Kleenex, but it's actually not. That's why I often say global underlay, because I actually have a different term and a different style that I use from what is traditionally knockdown, because knockdown stitching is actually a very particular thing. It's a tool. It's a tool that's built into Embrilliance software, so it's something that's in the enthusiast range. But here's the thing, knockdown stitching, that's a specific tool, but what we're talking about in general when we're talking about that, actually it is a global underlay. This is a global underlay that is used as a foundation. And the kind that I use, and I'll show you how to make mine as well, is what I like to call a light mesh fill. I call it a light mesh fill because it's a nice generic term. It's not something that is a trademark. But what I will say about this, I'm very glad for the term knockdown. I'm very glad for the story, because what it did is it started off Brian and I talking about embroidery and getting into the deep and geeky background of software and stuff that got me here to be doing the development work and the fun stuff and education that I do now. So I have to say I really love knockdown stitching for a lot of reasons. But here's the thing. Essentially what we're talking about functionally is what we refer to as a global underlay. And what we mean by global is that it's under the entire world of the design. Everywhere under the design, there is a new underlay being added. And when we're talking about whether it is knockdown stitching or my light mesh fill that I create, and I digitize those myself, this tool essentially is used usually in the following fashion. You will lay down some sort of light filling stitch. There's different ways that it can be styled, but you'll lay down a light filling stitch in the same color as the garment or the piece that you're working on. And that light filling stitch will then knock down, that's why we call it that technically, or it will hold down the pile of that material. And what ends up happening, once all the loops are held down, once the tension is in place, once all those stitches are in place, it provides a smooth, flat surface without a great deal of texture that you can stitch on. And the thing is, it is not a solid high density fill stitch. Some people will do that. They will throw an entire high density fill stitch on it. But what I'm going to tell you is you absolutely don't need that much density to get it done. So because we were talking about the different kinds of things, and I'll bring this on to here. Knockdown is nice to use. Yes, I will agree, Carmen. Knockdown is super nice to use. But here's what I'm going to say is that no matter how you do it, it is supposed to be light. It should be light. You should see the material through it. And you should be using thread as that stabilizing force. And on top of it, what you end up doing is just providing enough thread to hold down the loops and enough to smooth out the surface. It shouldn't be a full fill in any case. I don't like to run on a full fill, because what happens is when you run on full fill, that means if you're using an existing design, especially if you're trying to remediate problems with a design that you've purchased, a stock design, something somebody digitized for you, that tool, if you go ahead and drop a full fill underneath it, that's going to end up causing excess density, thread breaks, issues with quality, and you're going to have something that feels like a cardboard plaque in the middle of your design, the middle of your apparel or your toweling. You don't want that. So I like to use something much lighter, and I like to color match it. So we'll actually go back once again. And I like this. Frank's right. Global underlay and light mesh fill sound so technical. Welcome to the Takeup, Frank. I always sound too technical. I agree. And so let's go ahead and bring Brian Bailey on this. Since I'm doing comments for a second, let's go ahead and go like this. When I created Knockdown as a tool, my goal was to automate a global underlay for exactly the purpose Eric is showing. Two, I am not certain other people besides Eric and myself use the term global underlay. This is probably true. Apparently, Frank agrees with you, Brian, that the term global underlay is apparently a little dry for everybody. But hey, that's why the trademark on Knockdown. It's a heck of a term. But you know what I'm going to go ahead and do? Since we're talking about Knockdown and being pretty candid here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share the window from Embroidery so I can show you what we're talking about as far as Embroidery is concerned, and then I'll show you essentially how I build things. But we'll show you the tool, the actual trademark Knockdown tool. We will show you that, and then we will show you my method, the light mesh fill, and we can talk about that real quick. Because there's actually multiple methods you can do, and essentially what we're trying to do no matter what is lay down enough stitching that we can hold down the pile and that we offer, like I said before, enough stitches for any stitch to ride on. Enough stitching as an underlay, as a foundation for any of those top stitches to ride on and not fall into the pile, into the texture. So that's what we're trying to do. Give them stitches to ride on and hold down that pile, hold down the loops, the fuzz, the fur, any of that. So first, let's go ahead and I'm going to share the application here so you can see it. So here we go. This is actually that design you saw in the toweling, and I will show you that again. That is this piece here, and I will show you later because everybody always asks me this later, and I'll jump up and give you the full screen experience. You can see what I'm showing you. That is the actual toweling we're talking about. You probably won't get that focused, but that is the actual piece. So it's actually pretty small. If you're looking at it, it's not a large piece. There's a very small piece, and as you can see, it has a ton of little tiny straight stitch detail, and this towel is thick. This is a very nice, thick, high loopy towel, very high pile towel, and it works quite well. But let's go ahead and jump back into the software so you can take a look at it. This is the difference. I have to build a thing. I have to draw shapes and all this other stuff to make this happen. This is the thing that Brian created, and when I found out later on in my commercial life that this was a thing, I was a little shocked. Though it isn't the same style as what I do, it certainly makes things easy. It's a two-click thing. Add Knockdown. And there we go. So it actually does a contour outside the edge. And this is exactly what we're looking for. Knockdown stitching is a light filling stitch that is outside of the edge by a couple millimeters of the actual piece that we're working on, of the design that's there. And it provides that foundation. Now, Knockdown, the trademark stitch, this is what it looks like. It's unidirectional. It's on one angle. So it's one layer of stitching. You can see, and actually I can go ahead and play it for you so you can take a look at it. It's one angle of stitching. So that's the way Knockdown works, but it's automated. When you use Knockdown in Embroidery, it's an automated thing. The thing I build is a little different. Light mesh fill is a different setup, but this one you can see it's a unidirectional stitch, and it has a light density on it. As we've talked about before, we can always measure for our densities. We can measure from one line across the second line, and what do we have there? We have our density, and it's about 1.2 mils there. So that's what we're looking for. 1.2 mils, so we've got that spacing on it. Real easy to work for, 12 points. So that's what we're looking for. It's a very light material. So 1.2 millimeter spacing. That's very light density. That is not a full fill. That is not going to wreck anything, crash anything, cause you to have binding in your stitching. So as you can see, very simple to do. Very easy with a tool. However, I will say that I actually like to use something slightly different. And I'm going to show you the method that I like to use, because essentially I like to have something that has a little more multi-directional stitching underneath it so that we can help with multiple angles of stitching. As you see, I've got a lot of little straight stitch elements there. The one time I've ever had issues with using Knockdown, it's very infrequent. Most things will hold up just fine with standard Knockdown. But what you see up here in this upper corner, I can probably zoom in on this and make it a little more clear. When you have something like this really small straight stitch detail and it lines up with the same angle as whatever fill you have under there, having only a single angle of that fill means that sometimes can fall in. You'll find little straight stitch detail like this, which is not something you're always going to see on a towel, kind of a rare thing to do. But let's say, like me, you're taking a stock design and you are putting a stock design that you're not going to edit directly on that towel and you're not going to take anything out of it. Well, then maybe you have these pieces of the design there and you don't want to lose them. Well, that might fall in otherwise. You'll see this little piece here. It does line up with the angle of stitching, and maybe you have some issues there. So I like to use something slightly different. So yeah, nothing against Knockdown. In fact, I love Knockdown also just for the fact that it's creating that contour. As you can see, it's creating that shape that contour fills around the outside edge automatically, which is really cool, because then you're not, like I usually do, drawing your shape in. But here's the thing. I like to use the light mesh fill because it's not something that's necessarily better. It does, however, handle that multi-directional aspect. And you can see it. It does, though, give you a little texture. And that may be the drawback. If there was a drawback to it, I would say the drawback is that you do have a little extra texture there that may not be visible otherwise. And let's go ahead and take a look at that. As you can see with my pieces here, usually it sinks in pretty well. Now, what I am going to caution you about, and I'll say that here first, this piece here, done on toweling, you're seeing a lot of shine off of that background, off of my light mesh fill, because I used polyester thread back there. When you're on toweling especially, and it has a rough surface, or some Sherpas especially will have this rough surface, you may want to use a spun polyester or a matte finish polyester thread that has some fuzz to it, has a matte finish, because the shine can cause some issues. And I'll actually say that when we go down to this piece, I actually used a spun polyester back here. Something very much like a common, if you're sewing like a serger thread is very similar to what I used here. So a spun polyester thread that has a little bit of fuzz, it doesn't reflect light. And on this piece, I actually had to hold the camera and to get an angle on it, or hold a lighting source to get the angle on it just so that I could show you the mesh fill. Because otherwise, if you're just looking at it in a normal light, most of the time you're not going to see that directional fill. You're not going to see that background very much. You see the texture of it, but you don't see that shine. You don't see it very much. It does sink into the background and give you a debossed effect. It looks like it's a debossed piece. But we'll go ahead and let's pull that back up again and talk about it. The one thing you get from my mesh is there may be a slight texture. You see that it's kind of like a little bit of a dimpling here. The shadows are definitely not that highlighted unless you're looking at it with light at a really weird flat angle, but you do see a little bit of texture there that's different from the Knockdown, which because of the single direction doesn't make those kind of hashes. But what we will do is go ahead and take a look at that and show you kind of the method. And I said before that I actually had a class that was called Editing for Non-Digitizers, right? And Editing for Non-Digitizers, one of the things I said was you can throw this light mesh fill under just about any design, including this design that has these little, very small, straight stitch details, and it will hold up on just about anything, right? So let's go ahead and go to, actually I have these slides from that, and let's go ahead and take a look at these. If I can put this into the presentation mode for you guys, sorry about that. But here's the thing, we're gonna go ahead and move on beyond this. Here's the trick. And I called it very literally the fix for high pile and tough knit fabrics. I had some issues with the presentation earlier. I apologize for that. But as you can see, this is our piece here, and it's got the light mesh fill underneath it. Global underlay, it's just outside the edge of the design, as you can see. Very similar to the Knockdown, but this one actually just has 2 passes, right? And this one is done this way. And by the way, side benefit, this works excellently on knit caps with heavy rib. When you have a super heavy rib, this knit cap has very small text on it. That riders that's inside of there, by the way, none of that's filled in. The only part of that black that's filled in is on the tips of the feathers. The rest of that is all the knit behind it and the light mesh fill. And this is how you do it. You underlay the entire design with 2 identical fills that are one at 45-degree angle and the second at 135 degrees. This is the setting. Each one is set to 3 to 4 millimeters of density. So, you know, 30, 40 points. And it extends to just outside the edge of the design. So this is an incredibly light fill. And what it does is it makes this. Very easy to understand. We're starting in this bottom corner here. We're ending up in this top edge here. And we have that 45. And we're using, you would call it a travel edge or trapunto setting generally on that first run. First run has an edge underlay that is just on the inside edge. I do that actually to give myself a very clean, debossed look. So it looks like I almost heat stamped the material down. You don't necessarily have to run that edge run, but you will get some edge travel on it, as you can see in the second example that doesn't have an underlay. So that edge travel will get that little clean edge no matter what. You are going to have that edge travel, but no matter how you do it, I like to use the underlay. You don't necessarily have to on that first run, but if you're going to do it, I wouldn't underlay on both runs, only on the first. So this is the first fill, starting that bottom left, end in the top right, 45 degrees. We come back. We start in that area, and we're going to go ahead and let the software travel. We'll travel down to here, and we end in that corner again, 135 degrees, and what we're left with is what I call that light mesh fill. The light mesh fill provides you this very, like a chain link fence. It has these little diamonds, and the reason I like to do the 45 and 135, what I'm talking about is that angle is essentially to the top stitching generally, but usually you can just do it vertical and it's fine. If you were doing this as an underlay and underlay settings, you can actually do something very similar when you're underlaying a fill generally. Whenever you have settings that have double underlays, you can do this, or you can build your own underlay just under a design, not as a global underlay. And this works really great for color coverage. If you're having issue with like white thread and showing through on a fill, or if you have something that has splits in it that's showing too much of like a dark garment, this will absolutely help you get better cover coverage, better color coverage. Sorry, guys, and will have you hold down any sort of pile, any sort of texture that's under it. So this is the light mesh fill. It's really not particularly difficult, but the thing is, it provides you this flat, permanent surface and gives you an embossed look. This particular piece, and unfortunately I couldn't grab the sample for this in time, this particular piece was brought to me and it was chewed to pieces. Somebody brought me the original design with fills inside of that Res Riders area, inside of that snowboard. So the snowboarder kind of image, that kind of graffiti image that's behind it, all of that was filled up and it was like a bunch. It was just like a wadded fist of material. And that was because they tried to use all of these different fills and satins to fill this area. But on top of this knit, it was sinking and moving and causing issues. And the person who did the original digitizing didn't take that into account. So in order to lighten it up, for a couple of reasons. Number one, I like to lighten it up because I want to make it run a little better. I want to lessen the stitch count, make it run faster. But the other thing was it actually reduced kind of the way that this thing worked, because this hat, it had this big plate of incredibly dense embroidery on it. And what I'll tell you is, if you guys have ever done this, if you have a one layer piece, this was a one layer hat. This did not have a flipped band. It was a one layer hat. It ends up where that area is incredibly cold. And so, because it takes all the air out of it, we all know the insulation in a hat, in a knit hat, is the air inside of the knit hat that insulates you from the cold. Well, if you smash it flat and throw a ton of embroidery on it and fill it and bunch it up, now we have a solid piece of material that cold travels right through. And I will attest to the fact that if you put a bunch of heavy embroidery on a single layer beanie like that, it's actually a cold area. This provides a little bit more of the loft. Still not great. Still not great. If I were anybody who was buying one of these myself, I'd either probably have it manufactured, or I would use a 2-layer flipped band so that I didn't have to have that directly on the customer's head. But suffice it to say, that's another reason to do this stuff. But suffice it to say, this does provide you this flat surface and permanent stability. Permanent stability. When we're talking about toweling especially, those loops are going to want to get free. Sherpa material, fleece material, the loops, the fibers are going to want to get free over time. When we have something like this stitched in place, we have the same material that the top decoration is made out of holding it down. It's going to hold it down longer. It's going to work better. So that's the thing. And pardon me for flipping through these original files, but I really wanted to show you this because I want you to understand how incredibly simple this is. This can be placed under any design. This is not enough density to cause you difficulty with a design that's digitized correctly. The likelihood that that's going to cause issues, especially on the kind of materials we're talking about that are heavy, it's incredibly minor. So these kind of treatments are the best for handling texture. So that's the crux of what I wanted to say. But let me go ahead and bring up a comment from Brian. Sorry for. I love this comment Brian brought up. So let me bring this up real quick for you. Only Eric would discuss a quilter's issue with regards to digitizing winter hat, but he's quite right. I do wonder how many customers know the difference in such a detail unless you point it out to them. You know, and when we talk about details like this, I know sometimes I can get overly technical. And you're correct. With terms like light mesh fill and global underlay, it may sound like I'm overly technical. What I'll say is this. I'm not saying you necessarily want to spit these at a customer. However, you understanding how to use them and what to do with them means that you can provide additional value to your customer. If your hat literally feels warmer than someone else's, or if you recommend to them a different kind of beanie or toque or whatever you call the knit hat in your part of the world, because you want that decoration to have a covered back that doesn't scrape their head, that doesn't make it colder, that's a big deal. That's a big deal because you actually have provided them additional real value. And I mean that. You provide them real value. Something that actually makes the garment perform better. If you can make a garment perform better for someone, then absolutely, why wouldn't you? It makes the most sense to go ahead and go through with it. And I think that's the thing to discuss with everybody is that you providing that additional value means you can charge more. Your customers will be more likely to come back to you because they just have a better experience. If you never tell them what a global underlay is, if you never talk about knockdown stitching, if you never show them why you used a matte finish thread versus a shiny thread, the thing that will still happen is the person will get this garment, they will look at yours and they will look at someone else's who did a full shiny fill behind it. The full shiny fill stands out like a sore thumb and looks bad on the towel. Does it make it not sink in the small lettering? Sure, the small lettering can sit on top of that fill and maybe it looks all right. But when they look at yours and they look at theirs, you're like, oh, well, this one looks much nicer. It looks like it's a part of the towel. I don't know what they did, but it looks like it belongs there. It looks nice. When they have the hat on and they're not getting their head scraped up, they're going to say, that hat feels better. It must be a better hat. They don't have to understand the technical side of it for you to provide additional value and a superior product to the customer. So like I said, it may be a weird issue to talk about, and I definitely am overly technical, but it is something that I think is useful to people. And hey, multiple versions of it exist. I have seen people use many types of stitches to make this happen. I have seen someone go in with a cross stitch motif and use cross stitches. I don't love that because it seems like it puts extra density as it goes around. I actually like using the two passes. I will say the one drawback of the two passes versus something like a cross stitch motif is that the two passes does mean that one pass is on top. And that means there is some kind of directional grain. Similarly to knockdown stitching, you can see that there's a direction to that fill. So it does show, you can see that there's a stitch angle, and just like light reflects off of stitches differently depending on the angle, and we use that to create dimension in our designs, that is also something you can see when we have the knockdown stitching, that reflection from a certain angle, light coming in at a certain angle is going to show more of that background in one direction than another. So sometimes people will use those cross stitch motifs because it sews out individual crosses or patterns them as it goes so that they don't have as much of that layering. But what I've also seen is on super thick shifty material where the little crosses, because they just touch, sometimes the crosses, though they are pathed together, we'll actually see that the little X's are just touching. They're in a row touching where we have essentially had a stitch point and we're backing down off of it on each cross stitch where they'll actually pull apart. And you don't actually get full coverage on it, or you'll see that there's some patchiness to it. Usually doesn't happen. It's on super difficult material. Sometimes that can happen where they're not really kind of, if you want to say it, compensated for pull, and so they don't have quite the evenness perhaps that a fill or a, like I said, a knockdown stitch or a light mesh fill will have. But you can use it multiple ways. And in fact, there are people also now using automated underlay to do the same thing, where they will essentially make a piece that doesn't have top stitching, or they will use one fill that has top stitching in the angle and then use their underlay fill the other direction to create that mesh. There's a million ways to do it. The reason I teach it with two objects that are each in a certain fill stitch is that I know in any software you have, you can do that manually if you want to. Now, I mean, you go ahead and get yourself in Brilliance Enthusiast and click a button, 2 buttons away, and you've got a unidirectional knockdown stitch, and it works. And honestly, if you are a non-editor, a non-digitizer, and you just want things to work, get a tool that does it automatically and you're good to go. At least you have got that way to do that. You're somebody like me who gets a little detail work going and you want to have something incredibly tiny and fine that's going to hold up on a heavy towel, then sometimes the multiple directions can help you, or you want to tweak how much density you have, maybe lighten it as much as you can, or use a little bit more than you would have because it's super heavy and you want to get that look, then maybe you do it manually. The thing is, I think that automation makes sense when it works well and it doesn't affect the creative process. And I've said this before, when we talk about automation, everybody will say, you know, Eric, you always said no auto digitizing, why would you use an automatic tool? I don't consider making a contour around this piece to be the most super creative thing I do in a day. I just need to make this contoured shape and I need it to fill it in a certain way. If I could do that automatically, that's perfectly fine. Just the same way as underlay. Though I like to use manual underlay sometimes when I need it, if I just want a nice contour or edge run underlay inside of a column and the software I have will handle it well, I will use an automatic underlay because I don't feel like my creative choice was affected. Automatic digitizing, where you hand it an image and it decides where stitches go and it breaks up the objects in the way that it does via the mathematics in the program, that's taking away for me the creative impetus. I'm not able to then use that creatively in the same way I would. Now, you can use it for a starting point or whatever. I find that digitizing yourself first is not only better, but truthfully for me, it's faster than editing down all the shapes that an auto digitizer creates. So for me, hey, I don't like auto digitizing, but automation, yes. When it doesn't affect my creative process, when it's something that's functional like this, absolutely. And because, you know, I understand out there that there may be some people in embroidery who don't want to digitize. And as a digitizer and an in-house digitizer, I had to learn that the hard way by talking to people who didn't want to digitize. If you don't want to digitize, somebody who is editing, that's certainly something you can look for as an automated tool. It's going to help, and I have no problem with that. And frankly, if you're someone who uses stock designs with any great frequency, then having some way, like I said, light mesh fill, knockdown stitching, these things can be dumped underneath a stock design and they have an immediate effect, because what we're doing is preparing the surface before the stitching ever happens. Instead of thinking about this as part of the embroidery, right? Don't think of it as part of the embroidery. Think about it as making the garment, as making the material. We are affecting the way that the material will accept the embroidery. And when we start the top stitching, when we start the actual stock design, that's the beginning of the embroidered part. We are not really doing embroidery when we do the knockdown. We're not doing that there. Just because it's part of the design doesn't mean it's part of that creative process, number one, and doesn't mean that it is part necessarily of embroidery. This is part of us preparing the surface. So that's a great way to do it. And Brian brings this up, which is actually true. The users of our programs may not realize, but Knockdown is simply a fill. So once you create it, you can generate the properties for a second pass. Totally true, guys. So yeah, if you're someone who's using Embroidery's products, and you can actually take that shape and then reuse it. People do all the time. And in fact, what I like about that is then you get an automatic contour. Like I said, using a contouring tool, no matter what software you're in, selecting your object and using a contour tool to produce that outline is just, honestly, it's just smart. It's a smart thing to do, because most of the time it's going to give you a nice outline. And I'll say, back in the day, I had to make my own pieces where I didn't do that. And what I'm going to go ahead and bring up are a couple of other articles that I've written previously. I'm going to bring these up on screen just so you can kind of see some of the earlier pieces I've done. And I'll show you, this is actually down here, this Wells Fargo design. This is the very first design I ever did on fleece. Very first design I ever did on fleece. And I'll say, this is the first time I decided to try and do this sort of treatment. And actually, it was something nobody taught me to do this. It was something that I just kind of figured out. I tried to use some sort of light fill to work it out. And I'm going to say, if you look at it, I don't think I did a great job. It looks too textury. It looks too weird. And it's not what I eventually ended up with. Originally, the angles that I used weren't really great. I used the same angles that were present in a lot of the satin stitching there. I was using a fairly horizontal angle. And that means that a lot of the satin stitching was still kind of having interaction, where it was sinking in too much, despite the fact that it did hold down that fleece enough for that really fine text to show up. And as you can see, I didn't use it under the rest of the design, because the rest of the design on this fleece, it's not a super high pile. The rest of that design holds up fine. So it's totally fine to use this mesh underlay, this knockdown, just on a portion of a design that you need it under. You can do that by separating it out and using it separately. That's totally fine. I find that to be okay. And honestly, what I don't like about what I did down there is, for some reason, I don't know why, probably because the software I was using was tremendously difficult to draw in. The old QDT DOS-based software was awful to draw in. It didn't draw curves. It was all just tons and tons of little straight points. It was hard to use, so I didn't do a contour. I did that brick. I would never do that again. I would never do a big horizontal brick underneath that like that. That big rectangle would never happen now. But I did it back in the day, and hey, I'll say this, it saved the client, because they really didn't like the way that things were turning out. So for the price of a very few stitches, I was able to save that piece. So this is an older article that's there. I'm going to go ahead and I'll put that link out there for you guys in the comments so you can see what that is. But there's that piece there. Rather, like I said, older article. It shows that wristband, super, super tight, thick terry wristband with those really fine loops. Same thing happened there. Hooped that up and ran that. Same thing, gives you that debossed effect. Looks very nice. It was actually quite a hit. And you can see also the towels and that Res Rider piece. In fact, here's the thing. Luckily, I didn't have that sample handy previously, but let's go ahead and take a look. This is what the original file looked like. So you can see it was bunching up and causing trouble. Now, don't get me wrong. You can run a file that doesn't look this bad. The thing was, with all the excess density that was on this piece, with all the issues that it was having, essentially all it took was for me to rip out that additional stitching to replace some of the stuff that wasn't compensated to go underneath it, because all those outlines and underlays and stuff, those things were all on top of the white stitching that was present there. All I had to do to replace that design, to fix that design, was yank all of that out of there and replace it with a light mesh fill, and this is what I got. I didn't change anything else. I changed the text, the writers.org text changed, and that is about it. So all I had to do is use that light mesh fill, and this heavy knit beanie was saved. So like I said, this stuff, I actually do believe in it. It's something that I'm pretty hot on showing people because I think it really is useful. And this is something from an old printwear magazine that we saw here. And actually, I've got another example here of the terrycloth images. And this is another piece I did here. It was tips for embroidering directly on terrycloth. And we'll go ahead and give you guys that also in the comments in case you want to check it out. Nice article from Printwear Now Graphics Expo, and it has some of those pieces as well shown in it because I talked about some specific terrycloth issues. And also, this is another thing to discuss with you guys. You don't always want to fight it. Here's the other half of it. There is flattening it, and then there is flattering it, right? So what I always say is, okay, do we want to flatten this or do we want to use it to our advantage? Number one, sometimes you just don't need to. When you're doing something that's figural, you see down here on the right-hand side, we've got that white floral motif that's on top of that terrycloth. I didn't use any sort of specialty treatment aside from a little extra underlay under the actual pieces themselves. And I didn't worry about it. The pile was not super heavy. And when we're talking about a floral motif and not a logo, when we're talking about something that's decorative and it's single color, it's tonal like this, there really wasn't a reason to smash all of that flat so that I had a clearer look at the floral. And on top of that, when we're talking about a texture like this, something that isn't in the background, it doesn't need to be that clear. It's not that necessary to be that clear. And there comes a point when you're doing a larger all over piece or a decorative piece like this that we're starting to affect the functionality, especially when we're talking about a towel. When we're talking about a towel, we can actually affect the functionality and have it not run very well, not look very well, not be useful to dry off on. And you don't really want to be rubbing yourself with a big polyester embroidery, right? You don't want that. So that's something that we can discuss there. Certainly that is part of the deal. You don't necessarily always have to fight it. And if we go back also to the piece that I was showing you before, the other option we have here, folks, is to use it. The other thing we can do is use it for a technical reason. We can use it for essentially debossing the way it looks like technically. This time I'm using the pile to make something happen. And in this case, I've essentially got my light mesh fill parameters, same as they would be, but instead of using a color on this little paw pad, instead of using a color that sinks down into the material and hides, I used a darker shade that shows up. And what this has essentially is we've got both that light mesh fill, right? We've got both the light mesh fill, and we have a couple of rows of a faux split stitch. So we've got some texture around the outside. We have some interesting texture in here. And we've got open areas. And the open areas allow the fluff, allow that to pop up. So now I have a little paw pad that comes up proud of the design, and I'm flattering the pile, not flattening it. So I'm flattening the area that I want to hide in the background, and I'm using the rest of that fluff on purpose to make my design stand out. So the great thing is the same techniques that I just showed you for global underlay to help you tame the texture. Yes, you can tame the texture so we can stitch on top of it, but you can also tame the texture by using it to your advantage. And this works all over the board, guys. So it's great to see it here, but certainly we can also talk about the other things you can do with it. Here's another piece that I did, and I've actually got the piece here with me right now. And this is essentially a corporate golf towel, guys. This is something I did a few years ago. Rue Materials. It's got very small lettering in it. You can see that the materials text is actually quite small as I'm holding it there. And essentially, this was a piece where somebody showed me auto digitizing on this piece that they wanted to use, and it filled in the entirety of the background of this piece because that background was intentionally, it was supposed to be this navy color, the same as the toweling it was going on. Well, if we're doing that, why would we do that? Why would we add all that extra stitching to the piece? Instead of adding all that extra stitching to the piece, we used that little bit of light mesh fill to hold down the pile. Now, this is not an extremely high pile garment, but with the little tiny text that we see here, it absolutely does make a difference. So you can use this in a corporate function for sure. I know I showed you a piece that was essentially, a stock design piece, something that was fun to look at, but you can use it in corporate situations. And like I said, this is a pretty small piece. So this is not, it's not a small logo, but that text is pretty tiny, right? We're sub 5 millimeters on that text. Holding that up sometimes requires a little bit of extra work. And as you can see, I'm under pretty hot studio lighting here. And even though I know the camera's not going to pick up a whole lot, you don't see that shine. This is standard polyester thread on a really high saturation color like this on this piece. You don't see the standard polyester thread. But when we're talking about a piece like this where you have a really fuzzy kind of hotel towel that has a lot of fuzz to it, I can see lint lifting off of it while I talk to you guys. This really does make more sense to use a spun polyester, something fuzzy, or a matte finish thread for that background stitching. Makes more sense because it actually fits better with the piece. But for this towel, this golf towel, that's a very corporate piece. You can tell it's a golf towel. It's got the standard grommet on it, guys. This golf towel with a lighter pile makes sense to go ahead and use the polyester, and it doesn't show out too much. But the other thing I'm going to do before I sign off here, guys, first thing, let's go ahead and cover the stuff that we discussed real briefly. Temporary materials are temporary. Yes, water solubles and other temporary films are great for holding down the pile temporarily. When we're talking about stuff that's going to have to last through washings, when we're talking about stuff that's going to have to hold up to abuse, we may want a more permanent solution. And for my money, that's going to be using Underlay, using thread to make it happen, right? We want to remember to use Underlay as a foundation. And because people really loved it, and I think it actually is instructive, I'm going to bring back my screen one more time to show you this image. Just remember this thought. We are creating a boardwalk when we have our satin stitches, a boardwalk over a grassy field. We don't want the grass to hold up, so we need to either or both, lift up our planks and hold down the grass. We're going to do that by making a structure underneath. We have rails that allows the edges of our boardwalk to stay even, and it holds them up. And we have our zigzags. We have a little bit extra foundation under the boards to provide extra coverage between the gaps and to hold them up even further. So Underlay as foundation makes sense. So make sure you think about Underlay in a structural way. You are building a structure in 3 dimensions. Remember it that way, and you won't have to think about it any other way again. Other things we want to remember, Knockdown. If you're an Embrilliance user, you can use the actual true to trademark Knockdown stitching under any design you want to. You can bring it in and click a button, or if you're in any software, you can use my light mesh fill. And the settings for that are in the articles that are there. Please go to the comments and check those out. But it is essentially 2 fills, 2 tatami fills at 45 degrees and 135 degrees to provide little meshes, those little diamonds all underneath. As we saw before, any stitch usually is going to land on 2 or more rows of these threads. And when it lands on the threads, they provide that foundation for it to sit on top of. So what are we doing, guys? We are managing that texture. We're holding down the loops, and we're lifting up the top stitching. Remember the layers. Think of your garment as a field upon which you walk, and it will help you to visualize in 3 dimensions what's going on with the thread. On the scale of the thread, that's where we have to worry about the texture, not on the scale of the wearer of the garment. So the last little thing I'm going to do, since it's always fun, whenever I show you guys designs, somebody will invariably PM me later and say, hey guys, I'm in the DMs asking for where that design came from because I like it. This one actually is a stock design. The reason there's a C and an E in there is it's for my wife Celeste and me. I actually made that piece for us. If you go through my old articles, you'll see a lot of monograms that have a C and an E in there. That's why. That's a little Easter egg for you guys to know. My wife's name is Celeste, and that's why there's a lot of that going on. But I'm actually going to go ahead and show you guys. I'll show you a link. But that actually is a design that I drew up myself from an old book plate. It is actually available on my website. I know I don't put enough stuff on my website, so before anybody complains about not getting it, the link is now in the comments. If you want the design, it's over there to get. There are lots of designs like that I like very much. These book plates, these acanthus style pieces, and this that I call the foliated French cartouche, because I'm also, once again, being too technical and using far too many words for something I could have used something easier for. But yeah, that's something that I like to use. It has all that lovely little detail in it. But the piece that's here actually has a fill in the background. I eventually did that because a lot of people wanted to use it in multiple different ways and wanted some shading and some fills inside of there to make it a little more interesting. But yeah, that's the thing that I like to show people, especially with this, is that it only takes a very short amount of time, simple tools. Even if you're digitizing it manually, the most basic digitizing tools you can get will make these shapes available for you. Anything that can make a fill will help you make something that will knock that, flatten that pile. Pull that down, manage it, and create a texture on which you can stitch cleanly. Once again, remember, you're not altering the design so much as you are altering the garment, the material, the ground on which you're going to work. And that's what we're doing. If you ever looked at the way people have to prepare for prints, say those DTG people, direct to garment, they spray things down, they heat press their material to keep those fibers down before they print. Well, that's what we are doing in a much larger scale. In fact, we are preparing our garment, we are preparing the material to receive the embroidery. So with that, guys, I'm going to go ahead and call this a day. We're not going to go into super bonus times. It's a pretty simple topic, but we can eventually get into more. Certainly, if you guys are interested in knit hats, I know some people have wanted to get into that discussion. We can talk about hats again, or knit hats shortly. Talk about knit work and working on things that have that heavy knit. But I'm going to tell you, a lot of it is in the underlay, structural underlay. It's why I always teach you guys this stuff that I consider elemental. If you get down to the essentials, if you get down to the elements, the atomic level of what does the stitch do and how do we manage the stitch? Once you manage one stitch and then you start to put them together and manage groups of stitching, when you start to manage the actual material that we're working with, if you start to know how stitches work together, if you start to think of the structure, everything becomes elemental. It becomes the building blocks on which everything is formed. Right now, if you go out and find a new material that has a weird texture you've never seen before, I bet you'll be able to address it with the two things we talked about today. I know the first time I ever found a baby blanket that was minky, I believe they call it, that has the little dots, and it's got these little stretched embossed dots all on it, and I had no idea if it was going to run very well, but I knew that if I stuck a light mesh fill on it, it'd probably be flat when I needed it to. So go out there with this knowledge, guys. Go out there with this elemental knowledge and test. And if you find something cool or new that I am not talking about, some other kind of texture I haven't discussed, and you want to discuss it, ask questions, or show me how you handled it, please do, because I would love to bring this next time for show and tell and show everybody what's going on. Oh, and you almost got me, Mike. I love this. Last comments. Everybody's saying nice things and saying thank you. Mike says, wait, before you go, can you go over the different needle? Never mind. Take the rest of the day off. You almost got me, Mike. I was going to stop to answer your question, man. You almost had bonus time. All right, guys. Well, get in the comments, ask questions, share this with your friends. Hey, if you're on YouTube and you like it, like and subscribe. Why not? Ring the bell button. All the other YouTubers say it to you. But share it with your friends, because I would love to have all the decorators together, sharing this elemental knowledge, sharing their experience, and getting down to brass tacks, getting down to the basics that are going to allow us to address any situation we come upon, whether it's something you've discussed before or something new. So with that, guys, that is the end of the Take Up, and I cannot wait to see you again next Friday.